There is nothing scarier than the first time you pick up your baby and realise they are scorching hot, unsettled, and refusing to feed. I am an infectious disease doctor. Infections in their many forms are my bread and butter. Everything from the flu to Ebola. I literally spend all day at work looking after people who have infections. I have specialist knowledge and have passed exams on this subject. But the first time that James got sick, my mind went completely blank. I went into mum panic mode. My brain just remembered every horror story of sick children I'd ever heard. A tiny rational part of my brain at the back said, he's okay, he just needs some TLC and some time. And the other 95% of my brain was screaming, take him to a hospital right this second and tell the doctors and nurses there they need to save your baby. It turned out he had a cold. He had a fever for a few days and it was snotty and had a bit of a cough. He slept really badly, of course, and in a few days he was back to normal. But a tiny part of my heart still remembers that fear. And James was about 5 months old when he had his first bug, and that was about it until he turned 1 and I went back to work and he started nursery. And then there was this near constant plague of illness for all three of us from October until the following March. Anyone who has nursery-aged children will know this story. If your child hasn't gone to nursery yet, then let me prepare you for some bad news. We had cycles of diarrhea and vomiting bugs, tonsillitis, a nasty ear infection, hand, foot and mouth, and about 16 different colds that first winter James was at nursery. He had a continuous cough for about 6 months. We usually didn't have a day in between illnesses. As one tapered off, the next one was beginning. And I am one of those smug people who is never sick. I have my annual winter cold for a few days each year, and the rest of the time I am totally fine. And I cannot describe to you how these illnesses took me out. I was unwell more times in those few months than I have been the rest of my life put together. So yeah, it's hell. There is no possible way to sugarcoat this. But it's such a universal experience, and it's something I know both from living through it, but also I know about it from a medical point of view as well. So I thought I would do an episode on it. So yes, welcome back to 10,000 Steps with Baby, and today we're talking about illnesses. And of course, I need to start with the caveat that yes, I'm a doctor, but this is not medical advice. If you are listening to this and your child or baby is sick and you are worried, then please see your doctor. This episode cannot diagnose you, cannot offer medical advice in that sense. The second caveat is that I'm not going to talk about very young babies, so those, less than 8 weeks, less than 12 weeks old. These babies are more vulnerable, and fevers, diarrhea, rashes, the older children can brush off with no issues, can be a lot more serious for these babies, and they need to be seen by a healthcare professional if they're unwell. So firstly, I thought I'd talk a bit about the first thing that comes to mind when you realise your little one is sick. Like I said at the start, is it serious or is it normal childhood bugs? And sometimes people message me and say, oh, so-and-so has vomited 20 times, I need to take them to hospital. And of course I say, what I just said there, I'm not your doctor, yada yada. But how are they? And they say, oh, they're playing with their toys and running about and they've had a wee and they're having some bits of water. And to me, that is not anywhere near as concerning as a child who has just vomited once, but just wants to lie on the sofa, isn't having anything to drink and hasn't done a wee in hours. So I think one of the most important things is to trust your instincts. You know your child and what they're like and what's their normal. If your toddler is normally a mini tornado and now they just want to stay in bed, that's a significant difference. And that's a lot more concerning. So you know your child and trust that instinct that you have as a mum or a dad. So some serious red flags to be aware of would be any breathing difficulties. You don't want to mess around with that. So that would be things like breathing very fast, making noises or grunting when they're breathing, or looking like they're making a lot of effort to breathe. 2 would be difficult to wake up or wanting to sleep a lot more, seeming confused or muddled. I'd be very worried about sort of signs like that. changes in the colour of their skin for number 3. So blue lips, fingers or toes, having a yellow tinge to their skin or being very pale, that would be a warning sign. And not feeding properly. So I don't mean just slightly off their food or their feeds, having, say, less than half of what they normally would or not feeding at all. Other signs of this would be having fewer wet nappies or not going to the toilet to have a wee if they're an older child. And number 5 would be other things like having a fit or a seizure in a non-verbal child or a child that's a lot younger. Then it would be things like inconsolable crying that is different from their normal, or complaining of bad tummy pain. And those things are all things that need immediate medical attention. Things at the side of common normal childhood illnesses would be things like a cough, a runny nose, sore throat, but the baby or child is otherwise looking okay. So they're still playing or they're still happy for most of the time. They might be less interested in feeding or eating if they've weaned, but they are still having something. For diarrhoea and vomiting bugs, then I wouldn't worry about how many times they vomited or had diarrhoea, as long as they are still having fluids, water or milk, and still doing either in a nappy or a potty toilet, and they aren't complaining about bad tummy pain. Just going to have a word about fevers. So your child having a fever or a temperature really stresses people out. It definitely stressed me out. And just a reminder, I'm not talking about babies less than 3 months here, because if they have a fever, they need a review. But what a lot of people don't know is that a fever is often the body's way of trying to defend itself against a virus or bacteria, not the illness itself. So having a temperature or a fever can feel awful. You'll know that if you've had one yourself. But it is very, very unlikely to be causing any damage to the body. Doctors try to reduce people's fever by giving them drugs like paracetamol, but this is because it's to provide comfort, because people feel rotten when they've got a high temperature and they want to make you, the patient, the child, feel better, not because there is any medical benefit from not having the temperature, if that makes sense. And you might be thinking, well, what about febrile convulsions? And these, if you haven't heard of them, are a very, very scary but utterly harmless phenomenon where young children with a high temperature will have a fit. And these can be completely terrifying for parents, but it isn't the height of the fever that causes the fit. It's the sudden change in temperature. So it doesn't matter if your child has had a fever of 39 degrees all day and then it goes to 40 and then up to 41. But if you suddenly go from a normal temperature to 40 degrees, this can overstimulate young brains and lead to seizures or fits. And, I've seen this in practice with James. He's been hot and miserable with a temperature of 38 degrees. And he has been racing about with his toy cars, happy as Larry with a temp of 40. So I give paracetamol or Calpol or whatever you call it in your country when he doesn't feel well. And if he is happy with his temperature, then I don't. You can alternate with ibuprofen, which in the UK is Nurofen. If the paracetamol isn't helping, you can give Nurofen to children aged more than 3 months old. Things like stripping the child off to cool down or sponging down with cold water aren't recommended. The child or baby should just be dressed in normal clothes for whatever the room temperature is. And if your child has experienced a febrile convulsion, then I hope you're okay. I can only imagine how scary that must have been, but please rest assured it doesn't cause brain damage and it doesn't lead to epilepsy later on in life, which are some common fears that parents have. And one more little side note, Calpol or paracetamol, make sure you give the bottle a really good shake, because it can sediment at the bottom of the bottle and you can end up with a much higher dose, so give it a really good shake each time. And if you're giving it to a baby, then pop the syringe in between their gum and their cheek and do it very slowly so they don't spit it all straight back up. And then you think, oh my gosh, did they swallow some of that? Can I give them another dose? So that's a good way of doing it. And this might be quite specific to the UK, but over here you can buy Calpol, which is liquid paracetamol. You can buy Calpol and you can buy Calpol for more than 6-year-olds. So the problem is that it's got a different concentration of the drug. So the doses are different. So say you're a parent with an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old in the house, you might have both bottles, and it would be so easy to grab the wrong bottle in the middle of the night. I've heard of this story happening a lot. It's very easily done. So if that's your situation, then I would recommend only having the one type, the under 6 one, just to be safe, because then there's not going to be a risk. You'll just have to give more of the medication to the 6-year-old, the older child, but it means you're much less likely to accidentally give too much to the younger one. So some common childhood illnesses. So we've kind of talked about the red flags, things that we can't manage at home, things that we need to go take for an immediate emergency review. But what can we do for the common things that kids are having and looking after them at home? So coughs and colds. And it's the same as what you would do for yourself. So plenty of rest. Warm baths can help get gunky mucus out of noses and throats and sinuses and make you feel a lot better. Paracetamol, Calpol if they feel unwell or they have a fever that's making them feel rubbish. Coughs and colds very, very rarely need antibiotics. And antibiotics come with a host of other problems. So unless advised by your doctor, then I would avoid these if at all possible. They cause tummy upsets, diarrhea. You're more prone to having resistant bugs in the future. There are times when antibiotics are required, obviously, and your doctor will be able to advise you on that. But otherwise, my advice would be to avoid. It's not going to speed up the cold clearing if it's caused by a virus, and most of them are. If you're listening in the UK, you'll likely have experienced this if you've gone to the GP, that it's standard practice that you're not going to get an antibiotics for these sorts of things. I'm not sure what practice is like in other countries. It'd be interesting if anyone would like to tell me. Diarrhea and vomiting. This is a grim one when this develops, because you just know that even if you are meticulous with washing your hands and trying to be as clean as possible, that it is very, very likely to be coming your way very soon, particularly when they vomit all over you and you get a nice soaking in norovirus particles. Norovirus is sometimes called the winter vomiting bug, and it's very common in young children. The worst thing about it is that it spreads from person to person like wildfire. It gets better on its own for most people. The key with all diarrhea and vomiting bugs is that they are very likely to get better without any treatment, and to keep hydrated as well as you can. People often worry about not eating for older children, but humans are very good at going for quite a few days without food. It's not calories you need, it's fluids. So what you really need is water. So making sure your child is having little sips of water several times an hour is the best thing. Plain water is best, or milk if they're still on that, obviously, or formula. Fruit juices can worsen diarrhea, and fizzy drinks can upset the stomach further. So yeah, plain water or milk. If you're able to take some food, then you want plain toast, pasta, rice, nothing greasy or spicy, nothing oily. And it's best to avoid drugs that you can buy over the counter that stop diarrhea. Again, this is the body working to flush out the virus, the bacteria, and it's best to let it do that rather than slowing down what's happening in your gut. As much as it would be nice to stop diarrhea, I would avoid things like loperamide, antidiarrheal medications. The red flags I'd worry about here with diarrhea and vomiting would be severe tummy pain. If your kid really just isn't able to take in any fluids, or they're not producing much urine, much wee, those are the times that I saying, right, we'll need to go get seen by someone. And I'll put in a quick story here. The morning of James's first birthday party, he was pottering about in the kitchen while I made him some breakfast. And when I came over to get him from beside the fridge, I realised there was a bunch of slightly chewed up leaves from our houseplant on the floor beside him. And I wanted to rush him into the hospital to get his stomach pumped, but he looked absolutely fine. And when I googled the plant, it said that it could cause vomiting in young children if ingested. So I got rid of the houseplant and I kept an eye on James, who did in fact have a small a vomit. He was sick a few hours later, but he remained absolutely fine. So the party went ahead, and Jack's family arrived, his brothers and their girlfriends, and my family arrived, and we had some NCT friends come over with their babies and my cousin, and we had some tea and cake, and then everyone went home except my parents, who were staying the night. And that night James was sick a couple more times and then had a runny poo, and it was about this time that I first started to worry that maybe this actually wasn't anything to do with the houseplant. And then I was feeding James in the middle of the night when I suddenly realised I was going to be sick. And I sprinted for the bathroom only to find Jack already in there, chopping up his guts. I managed to go to sleep, and when James next woke up for a feed, I was sick again, and I could hear my dad vomiting in the other bathroom. And James was completely fine the next morning, but by now everyone else was at death's door. My mum hadn't caught it yet, and she tried to abandon us all and escape. And she made it as far as Wigan on the train before she vomited all over the train station platform. She'll kill me for telling you that, but and over the course of the day, just messages came in one by one from everyone who'd been at the party saying they were now vomiting. The only person who didn't get sick was Jack's 89-year-old grandfather. I tallied it up. All in all, we took out 28 people directly, and God knows how many more secondary infections there were. And when I look at the lovely photos we have of James's first birthday, all I can think of is how we were unknowingly handling and kissing what turned out to be patient zero. Most people will laugh about it now, but I can see it in their eyes that they have still not forgiven me. So anyway, that's a little side story. But rashes. Rashes. So this is a tough one. Medical textbooks describe rashes for certain illnesses, chickenpox, measles, parvovirus, hand, foot and mouth. But rashes don't always obey these rules, and it can be difficult to tell. Parvovirus is probably one you've not heard of. It's the virus that causes slap cheek, where babies get these bright red little cheeks along with cough and cold symptoms. Chickenpox is classically lots of small blisters all over the body, which are very, very itchy, and then they scab over with time. Hand, foot and mouth is also little blisters, but they tend to appear more on the mouth, the hands, the feet and the bottom. Alba's waking up. Okay, Alba's back to sleep. So yeah, measles. You shouldn't ever see measles. Most children are vaccinated now. There are rising cases in some cities, London, Manchester, where we live, due to people not vaccinating. And it can be a horrible illness with long-term repercussions. So if anyone is listening and has decided not to vaccinate their child or is on the fence about it and would like to speak to me about the science and research behind it, then, send me a private message and I would be happy to chat. Children and babies often also just come out in a sort of non-specific rash when they have a virus in a way that adults don't tend to do. The management of all these rashes is similar, so you moisturise the skin for the comfort from itching, try to avoid scratching or picking at the scabs to prevent infections, and watch out for areas that become hot, red, sore. This might indicate that the skin has become infected and needs review. And of course, the usual comfort measures if there is a fever or viral symptoms. One thing that's important with certain rashes in babies and children is if they have an infection that can pass to pregnant women. So that would be particularly parvovirus, talked about before, which is slap cheek, or chickenpox. Now, both of these are only problematic for pregnant women if they haven't had these viruses themselves previously. In the UK, most people have had chickenpox as a child. In other countries, it's not as common. But if you're pregnant and your child comes down with one of these rashes, definitely do not panic. Go see your doctor and chances are everything will be fine. If your child has developed chickenpox and you've got plans to go visit your pregnant friend, then in that situation, I would probably reschedule or talk to them about it. The other issue with rashes is the fact that most nurseries and schools will have exclusion rules for rashes. Every place seems to be slightly different. Chickenpox is usually until all the blisters have scabbed over, for example. This, as you can imagine, can be a total nightmare. We chose to privately vaccinate James against chickenpox as it's not yet part of the standard childhood vaccinations in the UK. It is going to be, but it isn't at the moment, because we were just terrified at the thought of us having to take potentially 2 weeks off work if he came down with it. And this brings me nicely to what is probably one of the most stressful parts of your kid being sick, and that's missing time off work. So I went back to work in September and James started nursery. Then began the winter from hell with all the bugs. And I work for the NHS, which says you can have 5 days of parental leave for things like sickness for full-time employees a year. I went back at 80%, So I had 4 days over the course of a year. And it soon became a habit that every Sunday evening, Jack and I would look over our work calendars for the coming week and divvy up who would leave for work, who would leave work each day if the need required. And the first time I had to leave work early, it felt a bit exciting. I was getting to leave work a bit early. I had some nice daydreams on the bus, heading to nursery about snuggling up with a poorly James on the couch and looking after him like a doting mum. And I soon realised that when one-year-olds are sick, they don't want to snuggle on the couch. They want to do all their usual games, and then they don't understand why they feel awful doing them. So they moan and cry and eventually completely lose it. So staying at work was 100% the easier option. And the first time I left work, we had lots of staff in, and I had already sorted out most of what I needed to get done that day. I wasn't leaving my colleagues in the lurch. And it was such a horrible feeling getting ready for the day and getting James up and realising he didn't look well or he had a temperature, and then realising that at work we were already running on minimal staff, and me not coming to work that day was going to create an absolute headache for my colleagues, who were always lovely and understanding. And of course, working as a doctor, I had an extra layer of guilt that me not being there to help the team potentially meant that things might not get sorted for patients as quickly as they could, or there could be delays to people getting their treatment, which just made me feel terrible. Jack took more time off than I did, as the nature of his job meant he could sometimes catch up with work in evenings. But we really felt the absence of not having any grandparents nearby. Jack's parents were more than 2 hours away, and at that time, Jack's mum was still working full time. My parents were 4 hours away in Glasgow. One morning, I got James up at 7 a.m. and realised he was sick. And me and Jack just stared at each other. Jack had a vital meeting he had already cancelled before. 2 of my colleagues had already messaged in our work WhatsApp to say they couldn't come in this morning, they were sick. I was on call that evening 30 minutes before I had to be out the door. James was crying and clinging to me. He was all hot and sweaty. And Jack got James into his clothes. Well, he called his parents and begged them to just jump in the car now and drive to Manchester. And I called a friend who lived up the road who had a son the same age as James and asked her if she could watch James as well until his grandparents arrived. And I remember crying on the walk to the bus stop. You know, I knew James needed me, but work needed me too. Patients needed me. No matter what I did, I felt I was letting somebody down. And I wasn't keeping James off every time he had a runny nose. I can still see the look the nursery workers would give me every time I passed off this clearly sick, miserable child to them and then dashed off. One time I only made out of the nursery car park before they called me and told me to come pick him back up. So yeah, it was just a horrible, conflicting time. When I was working before kids, I never missed work. I had called in sick once in my entire career before this. And so to me, it suddenly felt like I was dumping my share of work on my colleagues who were already stretched, as everyone is in the NHS. A very nice consultant who I unburdened to one day about how guilty I was feeling all the time told me that this was just a phase of my life where I needed my colleagues to pick up my slack for a short period, and there would be times in the future when I would pick up the slack for them. And that was really helpful to hear. And it was true. After that first winter was over, James has very rarely been sick. And as other colleagues have had younger children start nursery, I've been able to cover for them when they need it, or if they have other issues going on that requires them to take time off work or maybe leave early. So yeah, there is tit for tat in life, isn't there? So as usual, I don't really have any advice. It's a tough juggle, and I don't think anyone will ever think that they got the balance right. But as cliche as it is just a temporary phase. And anyone with older children will have experienced the same. So just try not to beat yourself up too much about it. How to survive. So just let everything go to hell. That's my only advice. You're probably not getting much sleep when your child is sick. They feel rubbish. You might feel rubbish and be sick too. If there's ever a time to just chuck the I should be doing this out the window, it's now. Let them sleep in your bed. Let them have all the screen time they want. Have cereal for dinner. Don't worry about making bad habits. Don't worry about losing routines. There'll be plenty of times to fix things when everyone is feeling better. I would say this is just about going into survival mode. Cuddles, warm or cold drinks, rest, more cuddles, Calpol. These will fix the majority of illnesses. And where to get advice? Don't Google. It'll come up with some terrible, terrible things, and it can't be trusted. Neither can ChatGPT. I wouldn't ask family or friends either. They'll be helpful, as I'm sure they'll want to be, but everyone is different. If you're the parent, but you're also a doctor or nurse or healthcare professional, I would try to just be mum or dad in this situation. You just can't think rationally or clearly when your mind is clouded by worry over your child being sick. I feel the pressure myself, thinking, well, I'm a doctor, I should know. And Jack, who is completely non-medical, often looks to me to make the sort of healthcare decisions about when we need to go see the GP or when we can ride something out. And that is a stress in itself, although he doesn't mean it to be. I try very hard now to switch off the medical part of my brain when my children are sick and go back to basic instincts. Am I worried? Or can we wait an hour or two and see how things go? So obviously your GP or the equivalent in your country, your family physician. In the UK, we have 111. If it's a weekend or out of hours, they can either help you get like an out of hours GP appointment, or they can say, okay, no, actually, this is something you're going to need to go to A&E for. They can direct you, give you some advice. And then, of course, A&E, an ambulance 999, if you're really worried. And the other thing is, remember that GPs, A&E doctors, paediatricians, they're all aware that children don't really comply with normal rules. They can look so sick and an hour later be running around the waiting room, but they can also be tootling along just fine until suddenly they're not. So no one is going to think you're mad or wasting time if your child is suddenly loads better by the time you're being seen. They would rather reassure and send you home with some safety net advice to look out for than to have someone sat at home worried sick about their child. The final thing is just about looking after yourself. I would try and rest when you can, even if that's just sticking on Paw Patrol and lying on the carpet, which I have done many times. Call in backup if you can, if it's available to you. It's a great time to try and call in the team. And like I said before, just let all expectations go out the window. If everyone just eats toast for 3 days straight in their pajamas, that's absolutely fine. That's pretty much what I've got to say about it. It's been quite long, but I hope that's been useful. If there's anything you think I've missed or anything else you think I should cover, then let me know. How do you survive when your kid's sick? I'd love it if you left a comment. And if you haven't already, please follow 10,000 Steps with Baby on Instagram. And I will see you next week.